Ancient cities withstood disasters that would shatter our own. They did this not by chance, but by design, using a forgotten science of shape and placement. By the end of this, you will understand the precise geometric rules that built urban fortresses capable of surviving earthquakes and biblical floods. How did a street's curve tame a raging river? Why would a temple's alignment anchor an entire city during a tremor? We are uncovering a masterclass in resilience, written in stone and earth thousands of years ago, and its lessons are urgently needed today. What forgotten wisdom does your own city's layout hold? This idea transforms everything. We often think of ancient cities as monuments to human will, carved defiantly into the landscape. But the truth is far more profound. For the master builders of antiquity, a city was not a separate thing placed upon the earth. It was an extension of the earth itself, a living system designed to grow with its environment, not against it. This foundational belief is the first and most critical geometric principle, the one that makes all the others possible. It is the principle of harmony. Think of the sprawling, meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley, like Mohenjo-Daro. They thrived for centuries along unpredictable rivers. Archaeologists find no grand walls built to hold back the water. Instead, they find something more ingenious: entire cities raised on massive mud brick platforms, with elaborate, city-wide drainage systems that channeled seasonal floodwaters away from homes and granaries. The water was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a powerful, cyclical force to be gently guided, accommodated, and even utilized. The city's layout was a conversation with the river, a geometric answer to a hydrological question. High in the Andes, the Inca embodied this principle on a staggering scale. They did not flatten mountaintops to build Machu Picchu. They studied the mountain's bones, its granite outcrops, its natural terraces, its seismic faults. Then they sculpted their stonework to follow the contours of the bedrock, locking their walls into the living rock. In an earthquake, modern rigid structures fight the ground's movement and often lose. But an Inca wall, bonded to the mountain, would sway with it, a flexible part of a unified whole. The city's plan was not imposed, it was revealed by the land itself. This is the core of the ancient geometric mindset. Astronomy told them where and when. Hydrology told them how water would move. Geology told them where the ground was strong and where it was fragile. These were not separate sciences. They were chapters in the same manual for building a lasting home. The geometry of their streets, the orientation of their temples, the placement of their reservoirs, every line drawn was a response to these natural dialogues. Survival was not achieved by creating the strongest possible object, but by designing the most intelligent relationship. The shape of safety, therefore, began not with a ruler but with deep listening. And from that listening emerged the first powerful shape, one that directed the flow of everything. The grid of Mohenjo-Daro presents a perfect geometric paradox. To our modern eyes, those straight, wide streets and uniform blocks speak of rigid control, of human order stamped upon the wilderness. But in the context of the trembling earth, that same rigidity becomes a form of brilliant flexibility. This is the principle of the sacred grid, and its primary function was seismic dispersion. When an earthquake strikes, the ground does not move as a single, solid plate. It ripples like a stone thrown into a pond. In an unplanned, organic city with narrow, winding lanes and buildings jammed tightly together, those energy waves have nowhere to go. They build up, crashing into structures from multiple angles, creating points of extreme stress where walls simply buckle and collapse. One falling building can then trigger the next, a domino effect of destruction. The ancient planners of the Indus Valley intuitively understood this physics. Their wide main streets, some over 30 feet across, were not just for grand processions. They acted as deliberate fracture zones, buffers of empty space that intercepted those deadly ripples. When seismic energy reached a wide avenue, its force was dissipated into the open air instead of being channeled into the next row of homes. The shockwave lost its coherence, its power scattered. Furthermore, the uniform size and orientation of the city blocks created a predictable structural response. Imagine a field of identical, closely spaced reeds. When the wind blows, they all bend in the same direction at roughly the same rate, sharing the load. But if the reeds are of different heights and thicknesses, some will snap while others stand. In Mohenjo-Daro, the geometric regularity of the buildings meant seismic energy was distributed evenly across the entire urban fabric. There were no weak links, no odd-shaped structures that would concentrate stress and become the first point of failure. This was ancient cellular compartmentalization. The city was designed so that if one unit, one building, did succumb, the damage would be contained. The geometric grid prevented a local tragedy from becoming a city-wide catastrophe. It was a lesson in collective resilience written in brick and mortar, proving that sometimes the strongest defense is not a single unbreakable wall, but a community of well-arranged cooperating parts. And this same geometric genius had a parallel, equally vital purpose when the threat came not from below but from the sky. But the rigid grid had a perfect partner in the fluid curve. Where straight lines dispersed destructive energy, curved lines gently persuaded it. This second principle, the mastery of curvilinear design, reveals how ancient engineers thought like the rivers they sought to tame. In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the legendary city of Babylon was not just a marvel of walls and gardens. Its very streets and canals were shaped by a profound understanding of water's nature. A straight, steep channel accelerates water, turning a flood into a battering ram that scours away foundations. But the builders of Babylon and those of the Minoan palaces on Crete centuries earlier intentionally designed winding streets and curved retaining walls. These were not artistic flourishes, they were hydraulic brakes. When floodwaters surged into the city, these deliberate curves forced the water to slow down, to lose its momentum and much of its destructive power. The geometry transformed a raging torrent into a manageable, deep flow that could be directed along predetermined paths, safely away from temples and storehouses. This was fluid dynamics written in mud, brick, and stone. Curved basins and settling ponds were placed at strategic points. As the slowed water entered these wider, rounded spaces, it would naturally drop its suspended silt and debris, a process called sedimentation. This self-cleaning feature prevented channels from clogging, ensuring the drainage system remained functional year after year. It was a passive, brilliant form of maintenance engineered directly into the city's layout. The ancient approach stands in stark contrast to our modern reliance on straight, concrete-lined canals and culverts. We often force water into the fastest, most direct route to the sea, which simply transfers the problem downstream with greater force. The ancients, however, studied water's innate desire to meander, to follow a path of least resistance that is rarely a straight line. Their geometry worked with that desire, gently guiding the water rather than confronting it. They understood that to control a force of nature, you must first respect its logic, and this respect for the landscape's logic extended powerfully upward to the third dimension of planning. The manipulation of water and earth was never just a flat, two-dimensional puzzle. It reached for the sky and dug deep into the ground, employing elevation as the ultimate strategic tool. The ground plan was only half the story. To truly become one with the land, ancient builders had to think in three dimensions, mastering the vertical world with the same precision they applied to the flat map. This third principle, tiered zoning and strategic elevation, transformed topography into a living blueprint for survival. It was geometry you could walk up and down, a masterclass in using height not just for grandeur but for fundamental security. Look at the breathtaking citadel of Machu Picchu clinging to its Andean ridge. Its layout is a perfect study in vertical risk management. The city is meticulously terraced, with each level serving a distinct, purpose-driven role. The lower, gently sloping terraces, blessed with deeper soil, were for agriculture and common residences. Higher up, on the unshakable granite shoulders of the mountain, sit the temples, the royal quarters, and the most vital granaries. This was not a random arrangement. It was a deliberate, concentric zoning of safety. Floods and landslides common in the mountainous terrain would expend their fury on the lower, more sacrificial tiers. The community's most critical assets, its spiritual heart, its leadership, and its food reserves were permanently secured on the high, stable bedrock, the city's ultimate stronghold. This same logic elevated the Greek acropolis in cities like Athens. The towering rock was more than a symbolic pedestal for the Parthenon. It was a practical fortress. In times of conflict or catastrophic flooding in the lower city, the Acropolis became an impregnable redoubt, a last line of defense where the community's core identity and leadership could endure. But the benefits of this tiered geometry were not merely defensive. It enabled life-giving systems. By placing primary water sources like sacred springs or cisterns at the highest point, gravity itself became the city's engineer. Water could flow freely down through stone channels and terracotta pipes to every level below, creating a resilient, energy-free utility network. Furthermore, the elevated positions of temples and watchtowers provided unobstructed sightlines across the entire settlement and the surrounding landscape. A signal fire or reflected flash of sunlight from the high temple could communicate across vast distances in moments, turning the city's vertical profile into an early warning system. This careful stacking of functions from the fertile lowlands to the sacred heights reveals a profound understanding of environmental gradients. The city was not a flat footprint imposed on a hill. It was an extension of the hill's own logic, its different elevations harnessed for different human needs. Every step upward was a step toward greater security and spiritual significance, weaving the practical and the sacred into a single, resilient form. And that connection between the sacred and the strategic points us toward the most mysterious layer of all, a dimension of planning that seems to reach beyond the physical world into something far older. This celestial alignment was far more than symbolic worship. It was a form of long-term structural insurance, a geometric contract written between the earth and the sky. To fix a temple's axis on the point of a solstice sunrise, you must observe that point for generations. Such a project demands an observation platform of absolute stability, a piece of ground that does not shift, settle, or flood. This practical necessity quietly guided master builders to the most secure geological foundations available. The very act of looking up to the heavens forced them to find the firmest ground on earth. In ancient Egypt, the relentless, life-giving Nile also posed an annual threat of destruction. The river's floodplains are soft, silty, and constantly changing. Yet the great temples like Karnak and Luxor stand with breathtaking precision, their long axes aligned with solar and stellar events. Research suggests this obsessive celestial orientation may have inadvertently placed these monumental structures on the Nile's natural levees. These are the raised, reinforced banks built up by millennia of sediment deposition, the highest and most stable ground in the entire river valley. By anchoring their sacred geometry to the motions of the sun and stars, the priests and architects were also, unknowingly, anchoring their buildings above the reach of the floodwaters. The sacred alignment created a terrestrial safety protocol. This pattern repeats across cultures. A community deciding to build a solstice-aligned observatory would not choose a swampy plain or a known seismic fracture. They would seek out a bedrock outcrop, a stable hilltop, a place that had proven itself immovable over centuries. The cosmic blueprint, therefore, acted as a sophisticated geological filter. It ensured that the most important, enduring structures were placed on the land's most resilient anchors. This marriage of astronomy and geomancy created an urban form where spiritual pillars doubled as physical ones, where the lines drawn to heaven also traced the contours of survival on Earth. And the materials they used to build upon these celestial foundations were chosen with the same ingenious dual purpose in mind. Yet the grandest geometric plan would fail if its smallest pieces could not bend. This brings us to the most intimate scale of ancient engineering, the very shape of the stones themselves. The walls of an Inca city are not smooth, flat facades. They are breathtaking mosaics of polygonal blocks, each one a unique, irregular shape with multiple angles and facets. To the untrained eye, it looks like an impossible jigsaw puzzle carved from solid granite. But in the moments after a tremor, this apparent chaos reveals its perfect logic. When an earthquake's waves pass through a wall of uniform, rectangular blocks laid in neat rows, the straight mortar lines become lines of weakness. The energy travels directly along these seams, prying the blocks apart until the entire structure fails. An Inca wall, however, has no such straight, continuous fault lines. Each stone is locked in place by its neighbors on all sides, its complex contours creating a three-dimensional network of interlocking teeth. Seismic energy entering this wall does not find a clear path. It is dissipated, redirected, and shared across hundreds of intricate contact points. The entire mass moves as a single, flexible unit, swaying and settling as one with the mountain it's built upon. It is a stone fabric that can stretch and compress. This micro-scale geometry extends to every opening. Look at an Inca doorway or window, and you will notice its distinctive shape, wider at the base and narrowing toward the top, a perfect trapezoid. This is not merely an aesthetic choice. Under the immense stress of a shaking building, a rectangular opening concentrates force at its top corners, the weakest points often leading to catastrophic cracks. The trapezoid, with its sloping sides, naturally channels those forces downward into the stronger, wider base and the solid wall on either side. It is a shape that invites stress to flow safely into the ground. This profound attention to the geometry of individual components transformed rigid barriers into dynamic membranes. Each irregular stone and trapezoidal frame was a tiny shock absorber, a lesson in resilience carved in granite. And this micro-scale defense did not work in isolation. It was utterly dependent on and empowered by the larger urban geometry we have already explored. The wide streets provided the space for buildings to sway without colliding. The tiered zoning placed these masterfully built structures on the most stable ground. The sacred alignments ensured they were part of a coherent, city-wide system. The small, flexible stone was the final, essential piece in a nested series of geometric protections, from the vastness of the celestial grid down to the intimate fit of one rock against another. This holistic vision raises a haunting question for our own time. If these principles are so powerful, why did this profound way of building ever fade from memory? Perhaps the most counterintuitive genius of ancient planning lies in what they chose to leave out. Beyond the streets and walls, the true resilience of a city was often defined by its voids. The grand plazas, the sun-drenched courtyards, the sweeping ceremonial squares were not merely empty ground waiting to be filled. They were deliberate, geometric instruments of survival, the city's built-in breath. In the bustling heart of a Greek polis, the agora was far more than a marketplace. Its wide, open expanse, framed by colonnades and temples, was a calculated buffer zone. When the earth began to tremble, this central void performed a critical function. Buildings could shake and sway on their own foundations, but the generous empty space between them prevented a deadly chain reaction of collisions. A toppling structure in a cramped medieval lane would pull down its neighbors, but in a city designed with rhythmic plazas, the damage was isolated. The open square acted as an urban airbag, a place where seismic energy could expend itself harmlessly into open ground. This same principle of the strategic void applied with equal force to the threat of water. In the magnificent city centers of ancient Mesoamerica, like Teotihuacan, the vast central plaza was engineered with a subtle, life-saving slope. During torrential rains, this enormous paved space would not simply pool with water. It would actively channel the deluge, transforming from a place of gathering into a temporary, shallow reservoir. By absorbing and holding millions of gallons of excess runoff, the plaza protected the intricate stone foundations of the surrounding pyramids and palaces. The water was slowly released or evaporated over time, preventing a catastrophic surge through the city's narrower streets. This was flood management on a monumental scale, using emptiness as a sponge. The geometry of these voids was never accidental. Planners placed them at the city's ceremonial and physical heart, and at regular intervals along processional ways, creating a deliberate rhythm of mass and space. This alternating pattern of solid and void gave the entire urban structure a flexibility that a dense, uninterrupted block of buildings could never achieve. It was a recognition that strength does not come from constant density but from intelligent distribution. The empty square was not a lack of planning, it was the plan's most sophisticated feature. And from these grand, life-saving reservoirs, the ancient engineers then asked the next logical question: how could they guide that captured water, not just away, but towards something vital? The city's grand plazas were its lungs, but its veins and arteries were far more intricate. This was the domain of hydraulic geometry, a silent calculus of flow and force etched into every street and channel. For the ancient engineer, water was not a simple substance to be moved. It was a dynamic force with its own physics, and to manage it was to engage in a continuous geometric negotiation. The goal was never to defeat water, but to persuade it to design pathways so perfectly attuned to its nature that the system would almost maintain itself. In the meticulously planned cities of the Indus Valley, this philosophy reached an astonishing level of sophistication. Their wide, straight streets were not merely for carts and pedestrians. They were the city's primary circulatory system, engineered with a precise, almost imperceptible slope. During the violent monsoon rains, these avenues instantly transformed into shallow canals, channeling torrents of water away from the raised residential platforms and down toward massive, brick-lined reservoirs. The genius was in the grading. The slope was calculated to be just steep enough to keep the water moving, preventing stagnation and disease, but gentle enough to avoid a scouring velocity that would erode the brickwork and foundations. It was a balance struck in stone and earth, a geometric equation for cleanliness and stability. This same principle of calculated flow governed their advanced drainage networks. Even the smallest side lane would feature covered drains built from precisely fitted bricks, all converging at gentle angles to avoid turbulent junctions. The cross-section of these drains was often trapezoidal, a shape that maximized flow while providing structural strength against the weight of the earth above. They understood that sharp corners collect debris and turbulent water undermines walls. Their geometry was designed for smooth, efficient passage, a self-cleaning system that harnessed the monsoon's own power to flush the city's waste. Centuries later and continents away, Roman engineers elevated this hydraulic calculus to an art of imperial scale. Their aqueducts are celebrated for their majestic arches, but their true miracle is in the line you cannot see, the gradient. To bring fresh water from mountain springs across dozens of miles of rolling landscape, Roman surveyors plotted a course with a drop of only a few feet per mile. This consistent, gentle slope was a geometric line of life, maintaining a steady, manageable flow that could run for centuries without bursting its channels. It was a triumph of long-term planning, a commitment to resilience measured in the slightest of angles. below the bustling streets, systems like Rome's Cloaca Maxima applied geometry for the opposite task. These great sewers were not simple tunnels. Their arched or vaulted shapes were chosen to withstand immense subterranean pressure and to allow for efficient scouring during periodic floods, ensuring the city's underbelly remained clear. From the household drain in Mohenjo-Daro to the mountain-spanning aqueduct, the same principle held true. The shape of the channel dictated the behavior of the water. By mastering this relationship, these civilizations transformed a capricious element of threat into a disciplined resource. They built urban ecosystems that could breathe, drink, and cleanse themselves, not through constant labor, but through the initial, brilliant intelligence of their design. This geometric foresight created a legacy that flowed far beyond the city limits, into the very fields that fed the population. A city's outer edge was a living membrane, not a dead line. While the interior geometry managed water and quakes, the perimeter faced the raw, undiluted forces of the outside world. Here, the ancient builders employed a masterstroke of defensive design, the intentional curve. In the Bronze Age citadel of Mycenae and other fortified sites across the ancient Mediterranean, you will not find simple, straight stone curtains. Instead, the walls zigzag dramatically, with projecting bastions and rounded towers creating a complex, angular silhouette. For centuries, we assumed this was purely for military advantage, allowing defenders to rain arrows down on attackers from multiple angles. But look closer, and a deeper, environmental logic emerges. That same zigzag shape is a brilliant hydraulic feature. When a flash flood or a debris-laden mudslide roars down the mountainside toward a straight wall, it strikes with its full, concentrated force at a single point. The impact is catastrophic, but a curved or angled wall presents a glancing surface. The oncoming torrent does not hit head-on, it is deflected, its energy split and redirected along the wall's face, channeled harmlessly between the projecting bastions. The geometry turns a crushing blow into a skimming touch. This was fluid dynamics applied to perimeter defense. The strategic placement of towers and gates further refined this control. Entrances were often set back or protected by elaborate funnels shaped for walls. In a flood, these features did not just keep people out, they guided water in, but on the builder's own terms. Rushing water would be directed into these stone channels and spillways, where its speed could be safely bled off before it ever reached the city's vital interior. The wall was not just a barrier, it was a sophisticated sorting mechanism, distinguishing between a human threat and a natural one, and responding with appropriate geometry. This reveals the holistic genius of the ancient approach. There was no separate manual for military architecture and another for civil engineering. Every element served multiple, intertwined purposes. A bastion gave archers a commanding field of fire, and its rounded base saved the foundation from being undercut by storm runoff. The symbolic power of these shapes was equally potent. The undulating, serpent-like wall mirrored the protective coils of sacred creatures in their mythology, weaving physical resilience and spiritual belief into a single, unbreakable cord. The city's shell was a lesson in adaptive strength, proving that the most enduring defense is never a blunt refusal, but an intelligent, multifaceted response. And within this protective shell, the final, most intimate layer of geometric wisdom was at work, in the very homes where families slept. At the very center of this geometric web stood the temple. More than a place of worship, it was the city's keystone, a structure designed with such profound precision that it anchored both the ground beneath it and the spirit of the people around it. Look at the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica. Their form is no architectural accident. That iconic, tiered shape wide at the base, narrowing as it rises, is the geometry of absolute stability. It creates a low center of gravity and distributes immense weight over a vast footprint, making it supremely resistant to the shaking of the earth. In an earthquake, while ordinary buildings might sway violently, these monumental forms would simply shudder and settle, their mass and shape making them the last things to fall. They were built to be permanent, and their geometry guaranteed it, but their role began long before any disaster struck. The very act of constructing such a perfect form required the most stable land available. The meticulous astronomical alignments we discussed earlier, the solstice sightlines, the stellar orientations, were not just spiritual exercises, they functioned as a sophisticated geological survey. To achieve celestial precision over centuries, you must build on ground that does not shift, flood, or slide. The temple's sacred alignment, therefore, almost always marked the city's most geologically sound location. It was the spiritual heart built upon the physical bedrock. This dual purpose created a powerful societal anchor. When a catastrophe did occur, the temple or pyramid often stood amid the rubble, a testament to enduring order. Its survival was not just a physical fact, it was a psychological lifeline. For a community facing loss and devastation, the sight of that intact, familiar form on the horizon provided an immeasurable sense of continuity and hope. It became the natural rallying point, the place where people would gather, organize, and begin the work of rebuilding. The sacred geometry of its design, which connected the community to the perceived order of the cosmos, thus translated into a tangible, earthly stability. It reinforced a collective identity and the shared will to recover, and from this unshakable central anchor, the city's lifeblood needed to flow outward, connecting every district and home. This was the purpose of the final, all-encompassing geometric system, the network of roads, the veins that connected the resilient heart to the farthest limb. A city's resilience was measured by the speed of its response. Beyond the temples and plazas, the true geometric nervous system of an ancient metropolis was its network of roads. These were not mere paths for daily commerce, they were calculated lifelines, engineered for the moments when everything else was failing. In the vast ceremonial city of Teotihuacan, the central artery known as the Avenue of the Dead is a staggering exercise in linear intent. Stretching for over 1.5 miles in a ruler straight line, it connects the Pyramid of the Moon to the Ciudadela complex with breathtaking precision. This was not just for grand spectacle. In a sudden, catastrophic flood, that wide, unobstructed avenue became an instant evacuation corridor. The geometry provided a clear, unambiguous route away from the low-lying ceremonial center and toward the higher, terraced ground at the city's edges. There was no need for complex decision-making in a panic. The road itself was the instruction, a geometric command that guided movement at its most desperate hour. But the function of this rigid grid extended beyond the immediate crisis. In the aftermath of an earthquake, when dust filled the air and rubble blocked smaller lanes, these wide, straight thoroughfares allowed for swift assessment. Authorities could rapidly survey damage along the clear sightlines, identifying which districts needed urgent aid. More importantly, these open arteries enabled the unimpeded flow of repair. Teams with materials, tools, and relief supplies could move efficiently from storehouses to disaster sites without navigating a maze of collapsed alleyways. The road's geometry turned logistical chaos into manageable order. This connective intelligence reached far beyond the city walls. The same meticulously engineered roads that served processions also snaked out into the surrounding landscape, linking the urban heart to its vital organs. The agricultural terraces carved into hillsides, the distant quarries, and the protected springs in the mountains. This was the masterstroke of extra-urban planning. Even if the city center was severely compromised by flood or tremor, these external supply lines could remain open. Food, water, and stone could still flow inward along those pre-positioned geometric channels. The city was not an isolated fortress. It was the central node in a resilient, life-sustaining network. The road, therefore, was more than a strip of packed earth or stone. It was a deliberate extension of the city's will to survive, a geometric thread that wove the safety of the high ground, the bounty of the fields, and the security of the water source into a single, responsive system. It transformed the urban form from a static collection of buildings into a dynamic, adaptive organism, one whose very pathways whispered the ancient formula for enduring any storm. The final lines of the city's plan were drawn long before the first foundation was dug. The master builders began not with a vision of what they would impose, but with a deep, patient study of what was already there. This was geomancy in its truest sense, a reading of the Earth's own geometry to find the hidden blueprint for safety. For these ancient surveyors, the landscape was not a blank canvas, but a complex, living document written in stone, soil, and water. Their first and most vital tool was observation, a years-long dialogue with the land to decipher its silent warnings and invitations. They would walk the proposed site through every season, watching where the winter rains pooled and stagnated, a sure sign of unstable, waterlogged subsoil unfit for heavy construction. They studied the graceful curves of river meanders. A wide, sweeping bend on the outside of a curve is where the current runs fastest, constantly scouring and undermining the bank. But the inside of that bend, where the water slows and drops its silt, naturally builds up higher, firmer ground. A city placed within that inner curve, that natural levee, started its life on a platform the river itself had built. This was not guesswork. It was empirical analysis, using the river's own shape as a guide to its behavior. They read the rock itself. Outcrops of fractured, jumbled stone could signal an ancient landslide or a hidden seismic fault, a place where the earth had moved before and would likely move again. In contrast, long, unbroken ridges of bedrock, aligned with the mountain spine, pointed to zones of profound stability. The very alignment of the rock strata revealed the skeleton of the land, showing where it was strong and where it was fragile. Even the patterns of vegetation served as a living map. Lush, dense groves of deep-rooted trees often indicated reliable water tables and firm soil. Sparse, patchy growth or certain types of reeds and grasses could mark areas of seasonal flooding or hidden springs that would turn building sites to mud. By synthesizing these clues, the shape of the water, the story of the stone, the language of the plants, the geomancer could draw the first fateful lines in the dirt. These lines determined everything. They set the city's primary orientation, often aligning a main axis with a stable geological feature like a ridge, rather than a cardinal direction. They established the zoning, placing granaries on the driest rises and crafts districts where clay or stone was readily at hand. They dictated density, clustering homes in the most sheltered hollows and leaving floodplains as sacred groves or pasture. This profound initial dialogue was the ultimate geometric principle. By letting the land's inherent logic dictate the plan, they avoided the catastrophic siting errors that doom so many modern developments built on filled wetlands or unstable slopes. It was an act of humility that yielded the strongest possible foundation, a partnership with the earth that made all the subsequent engineering marvels not just possible but permanently grounded. When the land offered no natural fortress, the ancients became sculptors of the earth itself. This is the ultimate expression of geometric control, the deliberate creation of artificial high ground. Across continents, from the sun-baked river valleys of Mesopotamia to the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi, master builders did not accept the limitations of their terrain. They reshaped it, constructing monumental platforms and mounds with the same precision they applied to stone temples. These were not random hills. They were geometric engines of survival, lifting entire communities above the reach of chaos. The iconic ziggurats of Mesopotamia, like the legendary Tower of Babel, were far more than stairways to heaven. Their colossal stepped form, a series of ever smaller rectangles stacked with perfect alignment, was a hydrological masterstroke. Each level acted as a giant terrace, breaking the force of torrential rain and directing runoff through carefully placed drains in the brickwork. The core was not solid earth, but a complex matrix of sun-dried bricks, reed matting, and bitumen, layered to create internal drainage and prevent the entire mass from becoming waterlogged and unstable during a flood. The shape itself was a trapezoid in cross-section, wider at the base and sloping inward as it rose. This geometry distributed the immense weight of the structure and provided crucial resistance against the lateral pressure of saturated ground, ensuring the platform would not simply slide apart when the earth turned to mud. Half a world away at Cahokia near the Mississippi River, a different culture arrived at the same brilliant solution. The Great Monk's Mound, the largest prehistoric earthen structure north of Mexico, is a masterpiece of engineered soil. Its base covers over 14 acres, and it rises in 4 distinct, perfectly shaped terraces. Archaeologists studying its construction have found it was not built in one continuous effort, but in carefully planned stages, with each new layer using different types of clay and soil selected for their compaction and drainage properties. The builders understood soil mechanics. They used expansive, water-resistant clays in the core and capped the surfaces with sandy loam that would shed rainfall quickly. The precise angles of the mound sides were calculated to prevent erosion, a slope gentle enough to hold vegetation but steep enough to shed water efficiently. By placing their most important ceremonial structures and elite residences atop this artificial mountain, the people of Cahokia lifted the heart of their city permanently above the river's unpredictable floods. The geometry of these earthworks transformed a vulnerable landscape. A flat plain became a tiered, defensible acropolis. The elevated position provided not just safety from water, but also strategic visibility, cooler breezes, and a powerful symbolic statement of order over chaos. This act of sculpting resilience from the ground up represents the most fundamental layer of ancient planning. It was the first and most profound geometric intervention, a declaration that a safe home was not found but built, layer by deliberate layer, according to a plan written in angles and elevation. This geometric wisdom did not stop at the city wall or the temple gate. It flowed directly into the home, shaping the very rooms where families lived, slept, and raised their children. The ultimate test of any city's resilience was not just whether its monuments stood, but whether its people survived. To understand that, we must look at the domestic blueprint, the quiet geometry of daily life. In the sprawling Neolithic town of Çatalhöyük, in what is now Turkey, we find one of humanity's earliest and most profound experiments in communal safety. Here, for centuries, people built not as isolated families, but as a single, interconnected organism. The houses of Çatalhöyük were constructed contiguously, packed tightly together like cells in a honeycomb, sharing every wall with their neighbors. There were no streets at ground level. To walk from one dwelling to another, you moved across the rooftops, using ladders to descend into individual homes through openings in the ceiling. This was not an architectural quirk. It was a brilliant geometric strategy for survival. In a region prone to earthquakes, those shared walls provided mutual structural support. When the ground shook, the entire neighborhood moved as a single, interlocked mass. The force was distributed across hundreds of connected walls, preventing any one house from collapsing on its own. It was collective security built literally into the fabric of the community. This clustering also presented a formidable defensive perimeter to the outside world, with only the blank, windowless outer walls facing the landscape. But the design's genius truly shone during floods. When water inundated the low-lying areas, the raised, flat rooftops became a secure, elevated network of pathways and communal spaces. Life could continue above the waterline. The geometry of the cluster turned a potential catastrophe into a manageable inconvenience. Within each home, orientation mattered deeply. Doorways and ventilation shafts were not placed at random. They were carefully positioned in relation to prevailing winds. In colder climates, this meant placing openings away from the direction of blizzards to minimize snowdrifts piling against doors and reducing heat loss. In arid regions, it meant orienting vents to catch cooling breezes while keeping them low to the ground to avoid dust storms. This was passive environmental control, a way of using simple angles and alignments to safeguard comfort, health, and the structural integrity of the dwelling itself from the wear of the elements. This microplanning created something far greater than a collection of shelters. It created neighborhoods that functioned as interdependent geometric units. Risk was distributed like the shared load of a roof. Resources were pooled with stored grain or tools in one home accessible to the network. The community itself became the true bedrock of the city's endurance. The safety of your family was geometrically linked to the safety of the family next door, fostering a profound, practical interdependence. This domestic geometry whispers a powerful truth. The ancient city's legendary resilience was not a top-down mandate from a distant ruler. It was a distributed intelligence, a pattern of cooperation repeated in stone and clay 1,000 times over, from the grandest avenue down to the humblest hearth. It was a geometry of mutual care, proving that the strongest shape of all is the one we build together. The strength of a network lies not in one perfect line, but in the presence of a second. This is the principle of redundancy, a geometric philosophy that rejected the idea of a single point of failure. Ancient engineers understood that efficiency could be a fatal weakness. A city with one magnificent aqueduct or one vital road was a city living on borrowed time. So they designed duality into their very blueprints, creating backup systems woven into the urban fabric. In the arid landscapes of the Nabatean kingdom, the rose-red city of Petra offers a masterclass. This metropolis carved into cliffs did not rely on a solitary spring. They harnessed every trickle, a vast, complex system of channels, terracotta pipes, and cisterns captured water from distant mountain watersheds, from seasonal floods in the narrow Sikh, and from the rare but precious rainfall on the high plateaus. These were not all connected into one fragile network. They were often separate, parallel systems. If an earthquake shattered the main aqueduct bringing water from the mountains, the city's hundreds of public and private cisterns, filled during the last rainy season, would still hold a life-saving reserve. If a flash flood clogged the channels in the canyon with debris, the high plateau collection system could remain untouched and functional. The geometry of survival was not a single thread but a woven mesh. This same logic of duplication shaped the movement of people. The grand processional way in a city like Babylon was not the only route from the temple to the palace. Running parallel, often just a block over, were secondary avenues, slightly narrower but built to the same robust standard. During a festival, these allowed for the flow of crowds. But in a crisis, a fire sweeping through a market, or a building collapse blocking the main thoroughfare, these parallel paths became instant detours, ensuring that critical communication and the movement of aid were never completely severed. The city maintained its circulatory function even if one artery was cut. This geometric redundancy extended to the most mundane yet vital systems. Many cities had dual drainage networks, one for stormwater and a separate, often smaller, system for household waste. A quake that fractured the main sewer would not necessarily cripple the city's ability to manage a sudden downpour, preventing a health disaster from compounding a structural one. This mindset stands in stark contrast to much of our modern infrastructure, where the drive for cost-effective efficiency often creates breathtakingly efficient single points of failure. We build one highway, one power grid, one water main. The ancient approach was fundamentally different. They viewed the city as a living system that must withstand unpredictable shocks. Their geometry provided options, always planning for the moment when the primary path would be lost. It was an architecture of humility, acknowledging that no design, however brilliant, was infallible. And this acceptance of imperfection led them to embrace a final, brilliantly flexible geometric strategy. A city's resilience was encoded in its most basic building block. The humble, sun-dried brick of Mohenjo-Daro was never just a piece of clay. It was a unit of order, a geometric constant that allowed an entire civilization to think and rebuild at scale. Every brick across the vast Indus Valley cities conformed to a strict, standardized ratio. Its dimensions were not arbitrary. They were a shared language of construction, a pre-industrial metric system stamped into mud and straw. This geometric uniformity was the engine of a remarkable kind of urban resilience, one based not on invincibility but on rapid, decentralized recovery. When a flood subsided or the tremors ceased, the task of rebuilding did not require a master architect to redesign from scratch. The geometric template was already in everyone's hands, literally. A collapsed wall was not a unique puzzle. It was a repetition of a familiar pattern, a pattern known to every mason, every laborer, and every family head in the community. The knowledge of how to assemble these standardized units was widespread, a common cultural skill. This meant reconstruction could begin immediately, in multiple locations at once, without waiting for specialized engineers or imported materials. The city could regenerate from its own geometric DNA, using the very rubble of its disaster as the feedstock for its renewal. This modular philosophy reached its zenith in the Andes. The Inca did not have the wheel, but they mastered the principle of the interchangeable part. Their agricultural terraces, those breathtaking green stairs climbing the mountainsides, were built with astonishing uniformity. The retaining walls, the irrigation channels, the step heights, all followed regional templates. If a landslide destroyed a section of terrace, the community did not face an engineering crisis. They faced a familiar construction task. They knew the exact dimensions of the stones needed, the precise slope of the channel, the geometric relationship between each level. Repair was a process of reassembly, not reinvention. This geometric standardization created a profound social benefit. It democratized the knowledge of survival. The security of the food supply, the integrity of the home, the stability of the temple, these were not mysteries guarded by a priestly class. They were practical skills embedded in the community's muscle memory, passed down through the simple act of laying one standard stone upon another. The city became a living system that could heal its own wounds, a collective organism that understood its own geometric blueprint, and this capacity for self-repair was not static. It was fueled by a continuous, generational conversation with the landscape itself, a slow accumulation of wisdom written not in books, but in the subtle adjustments of the city's enduring form. The geometry was not locked away in a vault or a scroll. It was sung, across generations without a single written engineering manual. These profound principles of alignment, slope, and shape were preserved with flawless accuracy. The secret was a living library, one built from memory, ritual, and the very stones underfoot. Oral tradition was not a primitive substitute for writing. It was a sophisticated technology for safeguarding survival itself. Critical knowledge was encoded in the rhythm of a chant, the steps of a ceremonial dance, or the lyrics of a work song. A melody might hold the precise ratio for mixing mortar, its verses detailing the proportions of clay, sand, and straw. The story of a mythical hero diverting a river serpent could, line by line, describe the ideal curvature for a flood channel. These were mnemonic engines, turning abstract mathematics into memorable narrative, ensuring that a master builder's wisdom could survive the passing of centuries, fires, or wars that might consume any parchment. The city itself was the ultimate reference text. An apprentice did not learn geometry in a classroom. They learned it by walking the processional way at dawn on the solstice, feeling how the sun's rays shot down the avenue's perfect axis to illuminate the temple door. They learned it by maintaining the drainage canal, their hands feeling the exact, gentle slope that kept water moving without erosion. They learned it by helping to reset a trapezoidal doorway after a tremor, understanding in their muscles why that shape held when a rectangle would fail. Every ritual, from laying a foundation stone to the annual cleaning of the aqueducts, was a practical rehearsal of geometric principles. The ceremony was the lesson. This deep cultural integration meant resilience was not a technical specialty, but a shared civic virtue. Every citizen, by participating in the festivals that traced the city's sacred alignments, or by helping a neighbor rebuild a wall with the standard brick dimensions, internalized the logic of their safe haven. The knowledge became part of the community's identity, as inseparable as its language or its myths. This reveals the final, most profound layer of their achievement. Their legendary resilience was forged from two inseparable geometries. One was physical, the precise angles of stone and the calculated curves of earth. The other was social, the interconnected patterns of shared memory, collective ritual, and mutual responsibility. The city endured because its physical form and its cultural spirit were shaped by the same enduring, intelligent design. Yet this ancient balance of order and adaptation was not a permanent fixture of history. To truly grasp its brilliance, we must see what happened when this philosophy was lost. The rise and fall of two later urban forms, the rigid imperial grid and the chaotic organic town, reveal the high stakes of geometric planning. The Romans were master engineers, and their iconic grid plan, the castrum, was a formidable tool of empire. Marching across continents, Roman surveyors laid out perfect right-angled cities with stunning efficiency. This geometric order enabled rapid troop movement, clear administration, and a powerful sense of Roman identity. But this strength contained a critical flaw. In their drive for uniformity, Roman planners often imposed their template with little regard for the subtleties of the local landscape. The tragic fate of Pompeii offers a sobering lesson. The city was built on a beautiful, fertile plain at the base of Mount Vesuvius, but its famous grid paid little heed to the volcanic slopes above or the natural drainage patterns of the land. When the catastrophic eruption began, the orderly streets provided no geometric defense against the pyroclastic flows. More tellingly, archaeologists note that earlier, pre-Roman settlements in the region show evidence of being positioned with greater sensitivity to volcanic activity. The Roman grid, for all its majesty, represented a shift from a dialogue with the environment to a declaration of dominance over it. Its geometry was imposed, not derived. Centuries later, as Roman order crumbled, a very different urban model emerged. Medieval towns grew organically, twisting like vines around the protective nucleus of a castle or monastery. These were not planned cities. They were accretions of need, with narrow, winding lanes that followed animal paths or property lines. This organic growth created intimate, defensible communities, but it also engineered profound vulnerability. In a fire, flames would leap across the tiny gaps between timber-framed houses, racing through the labyrinthine streets with terrifying speed. In a flood, there were no deliberate channels or plazas to absorb the surge. Water would funnel violently through those same narrow passages, becoming a deadly torrent. The medieval town was a geometric accident, a collection of individual choices that created a collective trap. It lacked the ancient foresight of wide, dispersive avenues or the strategic voids that could contain a crisis. Placed side by side, these two models, the rigid grid and the chaotic warren, highlight the unique middle path carved by the ancient geomancers. Theirs was a conscious, intelligent order, but one that emerged from a deep reading of the land's own logic. They did not impose a foreign geometric ideal, nor did they surrender to unplanned accumulation. They sought a third way, a synthesis. Their streets were straight where needed for dispersion, but curved where required for hydraulics. Their cities were zoned with clear intent, but those zones followed the natural gradients of hill and water table. This hybrid philosophy challenges our modern categories. We often think of urban development as a binary choice, top-down planning versus bottom-up organic growth. The ancient approach reveals this to be a false dichotomy. The most resilient geometry is neither fully rigid nor entirely random. It is a responsive pattern, a designed conversation that begins with the first and most important question. What does this place, this specific river, valley, or mountain slope, require of us to endure? The answer was never found in a universal textbook, but in the unique language of each local earth and sky. The geometry that could tame earthquakes and redirect floods did not vanish in a single cataclysm. It faded slowly, eroded by the very forces of human progress it was designed to withstand. With the ascent of vast, centralized empires, a new priority emerged: uniformity. The Roman Empire, for all its engineering genius, excelled at imposing a standardized template across diverse landscapes. Their iconic grid, their formidable roads, and their revolutionary concrete were tools of control and efficiency, designed to replicate Roman order from Britain to Syria. This imperial scale brought undeniable benefits, but it often came at the cost of that intimate, place-specific dialogue. Why meticulously study the drainage patterns of a local valley when you could simply pave over it with a perfect Roman street? The deep, adaptive geometry of earlier cultures was frequently overridden by a more powerful geometric ideal, the stamp of empire itself. This shift reflected a change in how societies were organized. In the integrated world of a Mohenjo-Daro or an Inca settlement, the knowledge of sacred alignment, water management, and structural stability was often held within a cohesive cultural framework, woven into ritual and daily practice. But as civilizations grew more complex and stratified, this holistic understanding fragmented. The architect focused on monumentality, the priest on celestial ritual, the engineer on aqueducts and siege engines. The city was no longer perceived as a single, breathing organism. It became a collection of specialized projects, and the subtle, synergistic principles that linked the temple's orientation to the neighborhood's flood resilience could slip through the cracks between these separate disciplines. Perhaps the greatest catalyst for this forgetting was a new material, concrete. Roman concrete was a marvel, allowing for soaring arches, vast domes, and rapid construction on an unprecedented scale. Its very success may have bred a kind of technological overconfidence. Why rely on the labor-intensive, precise geometry of interlocking stones to dissipate seismic energy when you could pour a solid, massive wall? The new material logic favored brute strength and volumetric space over the nuanced, distributive intelligence of fractal geometry and strategic voids. It represented a move away from working with natural forces through clever shaping and toward confronting them with sheer mass and new material science. This was not a decline in skill, but a fundamental shift in philosophy. The ancient approach required patience, deep local knowledge, and a humility before the land. The new imperial model valued speed, replication, and a declaration of human mastery. We traded a geometry of adaptation for a geometry of imposition. Understanding this loss is not about romanticizing the past, but about recognizing a rare and precious intellectual achievement. It helps us see those ancient street patterns not as quaint antiquities, but as sophisticated, time-tested solutions to problems we still face today. And it prompts an urgent question: did any community retain this synthesis? The echoes of this old wisdom did not disappear entirely. They persist in the layout of traditional villages from the Himalayas to the Andes, places where the memory of the land is still written in the path of a footpath and the angle of a roof. The proof of this ancient logic is written not only in ruins but in survival. In the devastating Gujarat earthquake of 2001, a stark, quiet lesson stood amid the rubble. While modern concrete apartment blocks pancaked into tragic heaps, clusters of traditional bunga houses in the same villages often remained standing. These are not complex structures. They are circular huts built from local mud and bamboo, topped with a conical thatched roof. Their simplicity is their genius. The circular geometry presents no weak corners for seismic forces to attack. When the ground shakes, the energy travels uniformly around the continuous wall, distributing the stress evenly so no single point bears the brunt. The lightweight thatch roof, easily replaced, also prevents the deadly weight of heavy tiles or concrete from crushing the inhabitants below. This was not a lucky accident. It was the result of a geometric form refined over generations in an earthquake-prone region, a vernacular answer to a perpetual threat. Across the globe, in the floodplains and deltas of Southeast Asia, a parallel wisdom holds houses above the water. The iconic stilt house geometry, with its raised living platform, is a direct, elegant response to seasonal monsoons and river surges. The design accepts flooding as a certainty, not a possibility. By elevating the home, the destructive force of the water passes harmlessly underneath, protecting both the structure and the family within. The open space below allows the current to flow freely, preventing water pressure from building up against solid walls. These living architectures are not primitive. They are highly evolved, locally sourced solutions, each shape a direct conversation with a specific environmental force. They stand as quiet, enduring rebukes to the one-size-fits-all model of globalized construction. Too often, modern development has dismissed these traditional forms as backward, replacing them with imported rectangular concrete boxes that are thermally inefficient, culturally alien, and critically vulnerable to the very local hazards the older designs had mastered. This disconnect is not just aesthetic, it is a matter of safety. The bunga and the stilt house demonstrate that true resilience is fractal. It exists in the grand civic plan of wide avenues and sacred alignments, and it is repeated in the humble geometry of the family home. It is a principle that scales. Recognizing this, a new frontier of research is emerging where structural engineers and seismologists are not just looking forward with new materials, but looking back at these time-tested shapes. They are using computer modeling to quantify why the circular hut performs so well, and advocating for building codes that respect rather than replace vernacular wisdom. The goal is a new synthesis where advanced material science is guided by ancient geometric intelligence. This is the hopeful bridge being built between a forgotten past and a precarious future, suggesting that the blueprint for our survival may have been drawn long ago, waiting in the patterns of the places that have always endured. The silent intelligence of these ancient streets is now speaking in a language of pure data. We are no longer just interpreting ruins through educated guesswork. A technological revolution is allowing us to peel back the layers of time and see these cities as their builders did, in full, functioning dimension. Tools like LiDAR, which uses laser pulses to map terrain from the air, are stripping away dense jungle canopies to reveal the true scope of urban planning. In places like the Maya lowlands, what appeared as isolated temple mounds are now understood as parts of vast, interconnected networks of raised causeways, reservoirs, and terraced fields, all engineered to manage water in a challenging environment. This is not just discovery, it is revelation. On the ground-penetrating radar sends pulses into the earth, painting a picture of what lies beneath without moving a single stone. Archaeologists can now trace the full extent of a buried drainage system in Mohenjo-Daro, following its gentle slope and junctions with millimeter accuracy. They can map the foundations of a Mycenaean wall to see how its zigzag course follows a hidden bedrock ridge. This subsurface vision allows us to calculate with precision the hydraulic capacity of a canal or the structural logic of a foundation. We can input this precise geometric data into sophisticated computer models to simulate exactly how seismic waves would travel through the gridded streets of an Indus Valley city, or how floodwaters would fill the central plaza of Teotihuacan. The results are conclusive. The patterns we observed were not happy accidents. They were engineered solutions, and we can now measure their effectiveness. This digital archaeology is uncovering an even more nuanced truth. While the overall plans show remarkable geometric order, the scans often reveal subtle, intelligent deviations. A street in a Roman city might bend slightly to avoid a particularly swampy patch of subsoil. A retaining wall in an Inca terrace might incorporate a natural granite outcrop as a built-in buttress. These are not mistakes or evidence of poor planning. They are proof of expert adaptation to micro-terrain features. The master builders had a rule, but they knew when to let the land itself amend that rule. Their geometry was a guiding framework, not a rigid cage, allowing for local adjustments that made the whole system more resilient. This scientific validation is transformative. It moves the discussion from stories of ancient wisdom into the realm of quantifiable, evidence-based engineering principles. We are not merely admiring their work, we are beginning to understand the mathematical and physical laws they intuitively harnessed. This turns their legacy into a living library, one that can directly inform how we build our own future. The question becomes urgent and practical. With this blueprint now in hand, how do we translate a 2,000-year-old geometric principle into a building code for the 21st century? This deep connection between ancient plans and living systems points toward a profound truth. The most stable geometries were not invented, they were discovered. Long before the term biomimicry entered our vocabulary, master builders were practicing its core principle, studying the enduring forms of nature and translating their silent logic into stone and earth. They understood that a landscape which had weathered millennia of storms and tremors held the blueprint for a city that could do the same. This was not mere imitation, it was intelligent abstraction, learning resilience from the world's oldest engineers. Consider the humble, perfect hexagon of a honeycomb. It is nature's masterpiece of efficiency, using the least amount of wax to create the greatest number of strong, connected chambers. This same geometric wisdom appears in the clustered dwellings of ancient settlements like Çatalhöyük. Their homes, packed tightly together, shared every wall, creating a communal structure of interlocking units. Like the honeycomb, this pattern provided immense collective strength, distributing structural stress evenly across the entire community. The shape minimized external exposure to the elements and to potential threats, while maximizing internal space and social connection. It was a human hive built on a geometric principle proven by bees over countless generations. Water, the lifeblood and sometimes the destroyer of cities, taught its own lessons in fractal geometry. A tree's root system does not rely on one thick, central taproot. It is a vast branching network, a fractal pattern that repeats from the largest limb down to the finest hair. If one root is severed, the tree survives because the system is distributed, not centralized. Ancient water managers observed this same principle in the branching deltas of rivers and the veins of a leaf. They applied it to their own survival networks. Instead of building one colossal aqueduct or a single massive cistern, they designed distributed systems of smaller channels, catchment basins, and local reservoirs. This fractal approach meant a single point of failure, like a collapsed channel from an earthquake, would not cripple the entire city's water supply. The resource was stored and moved through a redundant, branching web, mirroring the resilience of a forest drawing moisture from a wide area of soil. Even the way ancient structures managed force echoed biological solutions. The arch, a cornerstone of Roman and earlier architecture, finds its natural parallel in the structure of a bird's skull or a sea sponge. These biological forms use curved, hollow geometries to achieve remarkable strength with minimal material, distributing compressive forces along graceful lines. The ancient builders observed how shells withstood the immense pressure of the ocean depths, their curved forms deflecting and dispersing energy. They abstracted this principle into vaulted ceilings and arched bridges, creating structures that could bear great weight not through solid mass but through intelligent shape. They were building skeletons for their cities, using geometry as a substitute for bone. This philosophy represents the highest form of ancient planning. It moved beyond simply reacting to the environment to actively learning from its most successful and enduring models. By mimicking the shock-absorbing capacity of a forest, the flood resilience of a wetland, or the structural efficiency of a hive, they were tapping into a deep, pre-existing library of sustainable design. Their cities became more than human habitats. They became integrated extensions of the local ecosystem, operating by the same geometric rules that had maintained balance for eons. This alignment with natural law is perhaps the ultimate reason these places could endure for centuries. They were not fighting against the fundamental physics of their world. They were flowing with them, using shapes that the Earth itself had already tested and approved. In an age facing ecological and climatic instability, this ancient lesson in biomimicry feels less like history and more like an essential, overlooked instruction manual for our future. The principles are clear, but the real test is in the building. How do we translate a 2,000-year-old geometric insight into the steel and concrete of a 21st century metropolis? The answer lies not in copying ancient temples, but in adapting their core logic to our tools and our times. We can begin by performing their first, most vital ritual with unprecedented precision, the deep reading of the land. Today, we have the technology to see what the ancient geomancers could only intuit. Advanced Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, combined with LiDAR terrain mapping and subsurface radar, allow us to map a landscape's hidden anatomy in exquisite detail. We can identify seismic fault lines, model 500-year floodplains, and analyze soil stability across an entire region, all from a digital model. This lets us perform the ancient practice of geomancy at a colossal scale. We can now site new hospitals, power stations, and emergency command centers not just for convenience, but by following the land's own logic, placing them on the most geologically stable, elevated ground, just as the Inca chose their temple sites. It turns sacred alignment into data-driven resilience planning, using satellites to find the modern equivalents of those enduring bedrock anchors. The next step is to redesign our urban fabric with what we might call soft geometries. Instead of forcing rivers into straight, concrete straitjackets, we can reintroduce curvilinear greenways along their banks. These are not just parks, they are designed floodplains, modern versions of Babylon's gentle curves. During dry periods, they are communal spaces. When the rains come, they are allowed to fill, safely absorbing and slowing the surge, turning a catastrophic event into a managed, temporary expansion of the river's domain. Within our neighborhoods, we can learn from the strategic voids of ancient plazas. Instead of one central park, we can design distributed networks of smaller, interconnected green spaces and squares. These act as communal buffers, providing local gathering spots while also serving as fire breaks, heat sinks during urban heat waves, and infiltration zones for stormwater. They create the rhythmic pattern of mass and void that gave ancient cities their flexible strength. Even our construction can embrace this softer logic through modular, interlocking techniques. Imagine building components designed to lock together in flexible, shock-absorbing assemblies, much like Inca stonework, allowing buildings to sway as a unified whole during a tremor rather than fighting it as a rigid monolith. This shift requires a fundamental change in priority. moving from brittle efficiency toward resilient redundancy. Our modern cities are marvels of streamlined, single-point systems. One major power line feeds a district, one massive water main runs under a street, one highway is the only route in or out. This is geometric vulnerability. The ancient model, seen in Petra's multiple water systems or Mohenjo-Daro's parallel streets, teaches us to design distributed networks. This means creating microgrids for energy, where neighborhoods can generate and share power even if the main grid fails. It means looping water systems so a break in one pipe does not cut off an entire sector. It means ensuring multiple, robust transportation routes connect every critical node. Redundancy may seem less efficient on a spreadsheet, but it is the geometry of survival. It ensures that when one path is broken, the city's lifeblood can still flow through another. By weaving these principles together, intelligent siting, soft adaptable forms, and redundant networks, we are not building museums to the past. We are constructing a new kind of urban ecosystem, one that finally relearns the ancient art of enduring alongside the earth, rather than simply imposing our will upon it. A resilient city built only for some is a city destined to fail. The ancient geometric plans we have explored, for all their brilliance, carried a profound and troubling paradox. Their very success often depended on a hierarchy of safety. The sacred high ground, the secure citadels, the most reliable water sources, these were typically reserved for temples, palaces, and the elite. The geometry that dispersed seismic energy and channeled floodwaters also, intentionally or not, concentrated security and privilege. For the common family living in the lower terraces or outside the main walls, the city's resilience was a conditional promise. This historical truth forces a critical evolution of the ancient blueprint for our own time. The modern geometry of resilience cannot merely be about physical endurance. It must be consciously and deliberately about equity. It asks a new question: how do we use these same principles of intelligent placement, distribution, and connection to ensure that safety and essential resources reach every citizen, not just those with power or wealth? This is the ethical dimension of the plan, the crucial upgrade to the ancient model. It means inverting the old logic. Instead of a single, fortified acropolis for the few, we must design a city of multiple, interconnected high grounds accessible to all. This translates into practical, geometric choices. When planning new parks or green spaces, their location is not just an aesthetic or environmental decision, it is a justice issue. Placing a large, elevated green space that can serve as a flood buffer and heat refuge in a historically underserved neighborhood is an act of geometric equity. It uses the ancient principle of the strategic void, but distributes its life-saving benefits across the entire social landscape. The same applies to the geometry of movement. Wide, robust evacuation routes must form a web that covers the entire city, with clear, safe paths from every district to designated shelters on stable ground. A city where the only secure routes loop through affluent areas is a city planning for catastrophe twice over, first from the disaster and then from the social fracture that follows. The ancient concept of redundant, parallel pathways becomes a tool for ensuring no community is left isolated when danger arrives. Most fundamentally, this ethical geometry demands we distribute the resources of survival itself. It means decentralizing water storage with neighborhood-scale systems and rainwater harvesting systems, so a break in a main line does not mean thirst for those at the end of the pipe. It means ensuring community solar microgrids and backup power are integrated into the fabric of every district, preventing energy poverty from becoming a death sentence in a crisis. The goal is to move from a model of centralized, exclusive security to one of distributed, inclusive resilience. When every neighborhood has its own geometric anchors, its own access to high ground, its own clean water reserves, its own gathering spaces designed for safety, the entire city becomes stronger. The social fabric becomes part of the infrastructural fabric. This is how we honor and evolve the ancient wisdom. We take their profound understanding of shapes that endure, and we insist that those shapes shelter everyone. We build a geometry of inclusion, where every line drawn on the planner's map is a promise of protection extended equally, making collective survival not a privilege of the powerful, but the foundational right of a truly civilized community. From the seismic grids of Mohenjo-Daro to the hydraulic curves of Babylon, these civilizations demonstrated a profound truth. Resilience is a shape. It is a calculated geometry etched patiently into the landscape, a language of survival spoken through the angle of a street and the curve of a wall. Their legacy teaches us that enduring disasters is not a matter of building higher walls or stronger barriers alone. It is about designing smarter patterns that disperse energy rather than confront it, that channel water rather than fight it, and that ultimately connect communities into a single, responsive organism. We stand at a moment where our own ground shakes and our own seas rise, challenges that feel uniquely modern. Yet the answers we desperately seek are not all found in the future. They are also buried in the past, in these time-tested blueprints that offer far more than historical curiosity. They offer a paradigm shift, a different way of seeing the relationship between a city and its world. Let these ancient streets and interlocking stones serve as a powerful reminder. The most advanced technology is not always the newest material or the most complex code. Sometimes it is a profound and humble understanding of form and force, of working with the immutable physics of our planet rather than against them. This journey does not end here. I encourage you to step outside and look at your own city's map, your own neighborhood's layout with new eyes. Trace the path of an old creek now buried under pavement. Notice where the streets suddenly widen or how the oldest buildings cluster on a particular rise. What geometric stories does your home tell? What silent wisdom is written into the land beneath your feet? Share what you discover in the comments below. Let's unravel these mysteries together. And if you want to journey deeper into the resilient past, to see how other cultures decoded the language of their landscapes, subscribe. Our next exploration is already taking shape.